of classes together a semester or so ago. I think we naively assumed that by now we would have resolved all of the issues that could be addressed in the context of the rule of law. And of course, as recently as about 10 minutes ago, we were talking about the resignation of Paul Ryan and other things that seem to be going on in the world. So things are as unresolved as ever. Even the end of this class, which was originally scheduled to be the last one, is unresolved. So we will be back in 2 weeks on Wednesday, April the 25th, for a makeup class for the snowstorm that didn't happen. So I hope and expect to see all of you here for that. I will also note that we have among our participants in tonight's class the parents of Professor Urban, who flew out from Palo Alto just for this. So on that note, Dan, are you doing?
Jeremy will do it.
Jeremy will do the introduction, and we will hear tonight some thoughts and recommendations on ways that we could move forward, hopefully successfully, under the rule of law. So, Dean Paul.
Good evening, everyone. So we couldn't have a more opportune week for the discussion of the rule of law and how to keep it. Even just this week, from one perspective, the raid on Michael Cohen's office, home, and hotel by the FBI is a real tribute to our country. In many countries, nothing like that could ever happen, that the personal lawyer of the elected leader of the country would be subject to investigation for legal violations. It's truly a tribute to our system. On the other hand, I think a lot of us are waiting in equipoise, wondering whether this attempt to enforce the rule of law will provoke a reaction that might be contrary to the rule of law in ways whose resolution, contrary to our hope at the beginning of the semester, remains uncertain. So stay tuned. I'm sure we all will. This is a topic that I'm sure we'll come back to in semesters and years in the future. So I have the pleasure and privilege of introducing our very distinguished speaker here tonight. He's going to talk a little longer than our usual speaker because he's solo act, and we appreciate that. So this is Professor Michael J. Klarman, who was the Kirkland and Ellis professor at Harvard Law School, where he's been since 2008. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in political theory from the University of Pennsylvania, and his JD from Stanford Law School, and his PhD in legal history from Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar. After law school, Professor Klarman clerked for the Honorable and notorious Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and then joined the faculty at the University of Virginia School of Law in 1987, and was there until 2008 as the James Monroe Distinguished Professor of Law and Professor of History. Professor Klarman has also served as a visiting professor of law at the School of Law at the College of William and Mary, Stanford Law School, and Yale Law School. Professor Klarman has won numerous awards for his teaching and scholarship, which are primarily in the areas of constitutional law and constitutional history. In 2009, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Klarman's first book, From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, the Supreme Court and the Struggle for Racial Equality, received the 2005 Bancroft Prize in History. He published 2 books in the summer of 2007, also with Oxford University Press, Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement, and Unfinished Business, Racial Equality in American History, which is part of Oxford's Inalienable Rights series. In 2012, he published From the Closet to the Altar, Courts, Backlash, and the Struggle for Same-Sex Marriage. And in 2016, Klarman published The Framers' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution. Cass Sunstein, in his review of the book, called it magisterial and said The Framers' Coup might well be the best book ever written on the founders and their handiwork. So it's truly an honor and a thrill. I want to thank Professor Klarman for being here. Before you speak, we have our standard video clips.
Right.
So sit and enjoy, and thank you all for coming.
I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Gives me an opportunity to talk about the importance of democracy and what we can do to preserve it. Seems like that ought to be something that everybody feels very deeply. Despite the fact that I think democracy is very much at risk these days, I do have my own priorities, and I need to get over to Fenway Park to see the Red Sox beat up on the Yankees. So hopefully, as they did last night. So you're going to have to excuse me if I bolt probably around 8 o'clock or maybe even a little bit earlier. If people have questions that they want to ask and they don't get a chance to ask in the question and answer, I'm actually very open to answering questions by email, so you should just email me if you don't get a chance to raise the questions that you want, either during the question and answer or that you wanted to raise afterwards, but I've disappeared before then. Okay, so I imagine a few of you are not going to like what I have to say. Those who think that Trump is doing a fine job as president are not going to agree with what I have to say. That's okay. The point of higher education is to challenge one's views, not simply to have them reinforced. The task for you, if you do disagree with what I say, is to identify the facts that you think I've got wrong or the interpretation where you think I've been a little bit biased. Everything I'm going to tell you is a fact. It's not an alternative fact. I can cite chapter and verse from sources that are grounded in the world of actual historical facts. So if you do disagree with me, it's probably on the question of interpretation. Obviously, reasonable people can disagree about the way that they interpret the facts. I encourage people to explain exactly where I've gone wrong. So what I'm going to talk about is not politics or policy. I'm going to talk about democracy. I think that the policies of the Trump administration are egregiously bad, but what I'm going to talk about really doesn't have anything to do with policy. So whatever you think about building walls with Mexico, whatever you think about travel bans from predominantly Muslim countries, whatever you think about the tax bill, whatever you think about trying to kick 1 million people off of DACA, I'm talking about democracy, and I would think that people who disagree about these policy issues ought to be able to agree about the importance of democracy. So if not, then I think we really have problems, and I'm afraid we probably do really have problems. So I'm going to identify 10 basic norms of democracy that I think the president disparages or contravenes, and I'll just start off by naming them, and then I'll spend some time elaborating on each of them. First of all, the importance of an independent judiciary. Second, the importance of an independent press. Third, more generally, the importance of independent actors throughout the government. Fourth, the idea that political disputes ought to be resolved peacefully rather than through encouraging violence. Fifth, the legitimacy of elections and respecting the sanctity of the right to vote. Sixth, not using the law to attack one's political opponents. Seventh, not expressing admiration for foreign dictators who fundamentally don't believe in democracy. Eighth, the importance of transparency within government. Ninth, the maintenance of a sharp separation between public interest and private interest for public servants. And then 10th, at least a minimal commitment to truth-telling. I think on all of those there is substantial evidence that the president either doesn't believe in the norm or has been systematically defying it. So first, Trump doesn't believe in an independent judiciary, a judiciary independent of politics. During the campaign, as you may remember, he referred to Judge Gonzalo Curiel, who has lived all 60-plus years of his life in the United States. He referred to him as a Mexican and as a disgrace. Curiel is actually an American hero, At one point in time, he needed to have around-the-clock security protection because as a prosecutor in Southern California, he was prosecuting Mexican drug gangs who had threatened his life. Trump referred to him, as I said, as a Mexican and a disgrace. That's because he had issued adverse procedural rulings against Trump in the case challenging his fraudulent Trump University. As you may recall, during the travel ban litigation, Trump attacked the first federal judge out on the West Coast, I think in Seattle, for striking down the travel ban. He referred to that judge as a so-called judge. That judge was a Republican appointee. He attacked the Ninth Circuit as a disgrace, even before the Ninth Circuit had an opportunity to rule against him, just based on the oral argument in the case that Trump thought was trending against him. I'll make a prediction. Sometime within the next 3 years, Trump will defy a judicial order when he sees it as being in his interest. Second of all, the president clearly does not believe in basic norms about freedom of the press. He's perpetually threatening to open up the libel laws. He did that during the campaign. He's done that since the election. Opening up the libel laws means interfering with basic, well-established First Amendment protections for newspapers. He calls fake news everything that he disagrees with. He calls the press the enemy of the people, which if the president were not so ignorant of history, he would understand is a call for the extermination of the press. As Senator Flake pointed out in his speech in the Senate, that was noting that it was Joseph Stalin who called people enemies of the state, enemies of the people. Trump intimidates critical reporters. He tweets about them. He calls for them to be fired from their jobs. He points them out at political rallies, inciting the crowd to threaten violence against them. At one rally, the Secret Service actually had to escort NBC reporter Katie Tur to her car after Trump had incited a crowd against her and her safety was threatened. In October of 2017, the president threatened to have NBC's broadcast license removed. If the president weren't so ignorant, he would understand that NBC actually doesn't have a broadcast license, but you get the point. He made that threat because NBC was said to have filed a fake news report that Secretary of State Tillerson had called Trump a moron, which Tillerson on more than one occasion was given an opportunity to disavow and refused to do it. The president has urged NFL owners to fire players who protest racial injustice by refusing to stand for the national anthem. He threatened to revoke the NFL's tax exemption. Again, if he were not so ignorant, he would understand that that tax exemption no longer exists. He threatened to revoke that exemption if the NFL refused to crack down on the protesting players, nearly all of whom are African American and whom the president refers to as sons of bitches. The president's authoritarian bent is clear. What's less clear is whether he has enough competence to actually make inroads in this direction. Another form of the threat to free speech, which is actually much more likely to take hold than throwing New York Times reporters in jail. I think everybody says, well, that could never happen in the United States. And I actually think it's true. You're not going to see New York Times reporters thrown in jail. There are other ways of chilling freedom of speech. The Trump Justice Department is threatening to block the merger. It's trying to block the merger between AT&T and Time Warner unless CNN, which is the president's favorite media punching bag, is sold first. That is a merger that the Justice Department historically would never object to. It is a vertical merger rather than a horizontal merger, which most conservative economists would say are not a problem. It seems plausible that the president has intervened because of his dislike of the way CNN covers him. The assaults on Jeff Bezos and Amazon in the last month have been truly extraordinary. Whatever you think of Amazon and whether it ought to be subject to antitrust liability, the president has lied about whether Amazon collects state and local taxes. He's lied about whether Amazon pays less to the Postal Service than it should. This is all about the Washington Post, which sometimes the president actually acknowledges in his tweets. Jeff Bezos owns the Post. Amazon does not. Jeff Bezos does individually. The president doesn't like its investigative reporting on his administration. The president doesn't like its editorializing about the threat that Trump poses to democracy. He is trying to intimidate Jeff Bezos into doing something about the Washington Post coverage. The president's tweets have cost Amazon billions, perhaps tens of billions of dollars on its stock value. Think about the incentive effects that has on any other media organization that is thinking about whether to run stories critical of the president. This is exactly what authoritarian leaders in countries like Hungary, Viktor Orban, or in Poland, Jaroslaw Kaczynski have done. They try to destroy independent-minded media outlets, and they've been pretty successful at doing it in those countries in the last 5 or 10 years. Republicans in Congress, to my knowledge, have said absolutely nothing by way of protest upon this obvious and unacceptable assault on freedom of the press. Maybe the greatest threat to freedom of the press and freedom of speech comes from private vigilantism. After a Fox News commentator criticized the president's lack of response to the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville, which I think would have to rank high among the most vile actions of his administration, this Fox News commentator received hundreds of hostile emails calling for her to be fired and issuing death threats. That's because she criticized the president for his lukewarm response to Charlottesville. A union leader at the Carrier plant in Indiana who exposed the president's lies about how many jobs were supposedly saved when the president intimidated the country from relocating part of its manufacturing to Mexico was denounced by the president individually on Twitter and then received death threats. The person who videographed the killing on the Charlottesville downtown mall received death threats for posting that online, and the mother of the young woman who was killed on the Charlottesville mall also received death threats when she refused to meet with the president. So I have to say that again because that is beyond belief. The woman who was the mother of the young woman killed on the Charlottesville mall received death threats because she was critical of the president. She didn't want to meet with him. Third, more generally, Trump doesn't believe in independent power sources within the government. He thinks people owe loyalty to him, not to the U.S. Constitution. That's greatly ironic given the president's pretty much across-the-board failure to show loyalty to anyone but his own family. Think about his cruel, belittling treatment over the last year of Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who was the first and much of 2016 the only U.S. senator who endorsed Trump's campaign. As one of Trump's first acts in office, he asked FBI Director James Comey to show if he could be counted upon for his loyalty. As I'm sure you all know, the FBI Director does not owe loyalty to the President of the United States. He owes loyalty to the Constitution. Trump denounced Attorney General Sessions for not showing sufficient loyalty to him by recusing himself in the Russia investigation. That's a recusal that almost certainly is mandated by conflict of interest rules within the Justice Department. Trump has managed to pressure the Attorney General quite recently into firing the director, the deputy director of the FBI, and he has pressured him into initiating another internal Justice Department investigation into the FBI's investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails. He's repeatedly threatened to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller for conducting what the president says are witch hunts against him. If that were to happen, and I think could happen any day, don't know whether it will happen, that would be a challenge to the basic principle of the separation of politics and law enforcement. If the president can get away with firing a special counsel who's already indicted 19 people with regard to the Russia investigation, if he can get away with that without consequences, then we are far down the road to losing the democracy we always thought we had. Consider the following alarming statement made by the president just a few months ago, quote, "The saddest thing is that because I'm the president of the United States, I'm not supposed to be involved with the Justice Department. I'm not supposed to be involved with the FBI. I'm not supposed to be doing the kinds of things I would love to be doing, and I'm very frustrated by it. That is a remarkably candid confession of the president's disdain for the idea of independent actors whose existence is the whole point of our basic system of the separation of powers. This is also straight out of the playbook of authoritarian leaders around the world. Not only do they attack the independent media, not only do they try to take over the judiciary and pack it with their own appointees, but they try to undermine the separation of law enforcement from politics, both so they can insulate themselves from investigation and so they can intimidate their political enemies. Fourth, Trump encourages violence. He did so at his political rallies repeatedly during the campaign. He talked about, quote, knocking the crap out of them, referring to protesters, peaceful protesters at his campaign rallies. He said he would like to see protesters, quote, carried out on stretchers, and he said that he would pay the expenses of anyone who physically assaulted protesters at his rallies. He's being sued right now in federal court for inciting violence against protesters at one of his rallies in Kentucky. In 2016, August, the president said, this is still during the campaign, with regard to the Second Amendment, if Hillary Clinton is elected and would be in a position to appoint the successor to Justice Antonin Scalia, who died in February, that would be it for the Second Amendment, quote, nothing you can do, folks. And then he quickly added after a pause, although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is something they can do, I don't know. That's a sly encouragement to violence. Just a few months ago, Trump said in an audience of police officers that they should rough up suspects to widespread laughter. You have to wonder what they were thinking. Fifth, and maybe in my mind most seriously, the president questioned the legitimacy of the presidential election before it happened when it looked like he might lose. He wouldn't concede during presidential debates whether he would accept the results. He said, quote, we're going to have to see what happened. At a later presidential debate, he said, quote, I'll keep you in suspense. We'll see what happens. As a result of such statements, more than 50% of Republicans said before the election that they would not regard Hillary Clinton as a legitimate president if elected. One presidential historian said at the time, quote, I haven't seen anything like this since 1860, this threat of delegitimizing the federal government, and Trump is trying to say our entire government is corrupt and the whole system is rigged, and that's a secessionist revolutionary motif. That's someone trying to topple the apple cart entirely. Ask yourself what would have happened had the election results been flipped. Does anybody think that if Trump had won the popular vote by 2.9 million votes and lost the Electoral College, that he would have peacefully conceded the result? What happens with the next election when Trump is already president and refuses to stand down if he is narrowly defeated and he questions the legitimacy of the outcome? Then there's the recently disbanded Voter Integrity Commission, which everybody understands was actually a voter suppression commission. Half of Republicans believe that Trump won the popular vote, and nearly 3/4 believe that voter fraud happens frequently, even though it's a well-established fact among political scientists of all political stripes that it virtually never happens. One academic study found in a data set of 1 billion votes that there were at most 32 fraudulently cast votes, which is essentially zero. Trump repeatedly claims that 3 to 5 million illegal voters participated and had their votes counted in 2016. Everybody who knows anything about elections understands that is entirely impossible. In response to the following question, quote, if Donald Trump were to say that the 2020 presidential election should be postponed until the country can make sure that only eligible American citizens can vote, would you support or oppose postponing the election? 52% of Republicans said they would support delaying the election under those circumstances. If that's not alarming, I don't know what is. On the say-so of the president alone that there was going to be massive electoral fraud in the election, would you support delaying it? And a majority of Republicans answered yes. 6, in addition, during the campaign, Trump promised if elected that he would have his opponent jailed, something that previously would have occurred only in countries we think of as banana republics, not countries that espouse and are genuinely committed to the rule of law. In the second presidential debate, Trump declared, quote, if I win, I'm going to instruct my Attorney General to get a special prosecutor to look into your, Hillary Clinton's, situation because there's never been so many lies, so much deception. Now, most sensible people shrug that off as the sort of ridiculous thing Trump said during the campaign, but in the last 6 months, as his poll numbers have sank to record lows for presidents this early in their term, he's again been rallying for the FBI. He's been rallying his base by calling for the FBI to resume its investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails. Trump has urged federal law enforcement to, quote, do what is right and proper, close quote, by launching criminal probes of former presidential rival Hillary Clinton and other members of her political party. Just 10 days after the president issued that call, the Justice Department told Congress that senior prosecutors were looking into whether a special counsel ought to be appointed to investigate Clinton, and Attorney General Sessions, just within the past couple of weeks, has capitulated to the pressure by appointing a federal prosecutor from Utah to take up this investigation. It is beyond me why all supporters of democracy are not up in arms about this outrageous use of the power of the federal government to go after a political opponent. 7th, Trump professes a simply bizarre admiration for foreign autocrats. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, who, as you may know, has ordered the murder of literally hundreds of drug dealers and drug users. That's not an exaggeration. He has personally boasted of murdering with his own hands a couple of drug dealers. He should be in jail. Trump applauds him for doing an unbelievable job with regard to the drug problem in the Philippines. Trump has rooted for the election in France of the neo-fascist candidate Marine Le Pen. He offered a congratulatory phone call to Turkish President Recep Erdogan, who has jailed tens of thousands of political opponents and journalists. And this was congratulations for winning a fraud-ridden referendum that conferred vastly expanded powers on the office of the presidency. Trump has called Putin a strong leader and expressed open admiration for his 82% approval rating. When it was pointed out to Trump after the election that Putin had had political enemies murdered, Trump responded, quote, there are a lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. You think our country is so innocent. If any other president in American history had said that, my bet is that they would have been instantly impeached. Trump recently ignored the advice of most of his national security advisors. He congratulated Putin on his election to a 4th term with an overwhelming majority in an election where Putin would not permit his principal political opponent to campaign, and in which nobody thought was a free and fair election, and within 2 weeks of Putin apparently trying to have defectors murdered in Great Britain. 8th, flouting of transparency norms that are critical to democracy. Trump, as you know, is the first presidential candidate in 40 years not to release his tax returns. He's lied about that, saying during the campaign that he would release his tax returns after the election once the IRS audit was conducted. Since the election, he's made it clear through his spokespeople that he's not releasing his tax returns under any circumstances. The White House no longer releases visitor logs, so you have no way of knowing what lobbyists are hanging out doing their dirty work in the White House. Trump gave one solo press conference in his first 200 days in office. By comparison, Obama had conducted 9 solo press conferences during that same time. Democracy depends on transparency. The electorate can't become informed unless they know what's going on within their government. The Trump administration is the least transparent presidential administration in modern history. 9, democracy depends on public servants separating their private interest from the public interest to a degree unprecedented in all of American history. Trump has declined to recognize that principle of separation. Foreign nations and their embassies, such as Azerbaijan and Bahrain, book events at the Trump Hotel in the District of Columbia, which charges $150 more than any other luxury hotel in the city for similar bookings. Conservative think tanks book events at the Trump Hotel in D.C., with administration officials appearing, as do lobbyists who are representing the interests of foreign nations. The Trump Organization, which initially said that all hotel profits that came from foreign visitors would be donated to the U.S. Treasury, has said since the election that they can't do that because it's too burdensome to identify which visitors are foreign and which are not. The president's Mar-a-Lago estate in Palm Beach, Florida, doubled its initiation fees to $200,000 immediately after the election and has doubled its profits since Trump first became a serious candidate. In May, as you may have read about, May in 2017, Kushner companies held marketing events in China in which they were basically trying to raise $100 million by selling off these $500,000 investment visas in which foreigners, by contributing $500,000 to an appropriate project in the United States, can essentially purchase a visa. At those meetings, Jared Kushner's sister promoted the company's connections to the Trump administration. The project, quote, means a lot to me and my entire family, she told prospective investors. Trump has bragged of doing tens of millions of dollars of business with the Saudis over the past couple of decades. For example, at a 2005 presidential rally in Alabama, Trump noted that the Saudis, quote, buy apartments from me. They spend $40 million, $50 million, and I'm supposed to dislike them. I like them very much. One wonders if that relationship possibly has something to do with the fact that Trump has sided with Saudi Arabia in its dispute last year with Qatar, notwithstanding the fact that the Secretaries of Defense and State urged Trump not to do so. It turns out Qatar has the United States' largest military base in the region, which makes Trump's behavior verging on insanity. The United States has also remained silent while Saudi Arabia kidnapped the president of Lebanon and has created the world's greatest humanitarian and famine crisis in Yemen. The administration's travel ban conveniently avoids any Muslim-majority country where Trump has done a business deal. Just a few months ago, when Trump was returning from his visit to Southeast Asia and was in the Philippines meeting with his buddy Duterte, also in attendance was a Filipino real estate developer who is Trump's partner in a $150 million luxury apartment complex in Manila, who happens to serve as Duterte's trade envoy to the United States. We used to not have to worry about American foreign policy was being tainted by the president's business interests. Wouldn't it be nice if that were still the case? 10th, and finally, the president is, as you may have noticed, a pathological liar. He lies about small things, like what's the crowd size at his inauguration, what was the weather at his inauguration, whether local sellers of inaugural ball gowns had sold out of their gowns before the inauguration, whether the Boy Scout leader called him up to congratulate him on his extraordinarily inappropriate speech to the Boy Scouts last year in West Virginia. But he also lies about things that are very large and consequential. Trump lied about whether he supported the Iraq War before he chose to oppose it. He lies about whether murder rates in the United States are at an all-time 50-year high. They're actually much closer to a 50-year all-time low. He lies about whether the Obama administration wiretapped Trump Tower. He lied about whether President Obama was born in the United States. He was the principal proponent of that racist birther lie. He lies about whether 3 to 5 million Americans voted illegally, non-citizens voted illegally. Just in the last couple weeks, he lied about this caravan that's proceeding through Mexico. He said that women were being raped at rates that we've never seen before. There is absolutely no evidence, zero evidence. Journalists who are traveling with the caravan report this is just untrue. The president just decided to make it up because he thought he could get away with it. Washington Post calculated 1,500 lies during the president's first 300 days in office. That's nearly 5 lies a day. That's a pretty hefty accomplishment, even if you discount for exaggeration from the fake news Washington Post. It's not clear if a democracy can survive with that level of falsehood. Americans need to be able to distinguish the truth from falsehoods. Trump doesn't tell the truth, yet 80% of Republicans believe the president more than they believe CNN. CNN would fire a reporter instantly for stating any of the lies that Trump has propagated in his first year in office without apparent repercussion. 46% of Americans in a recent poll agreed that the mainstream media makes up lies about Trump. I would bet you $500 on the spot that you couldn't come up with a single instance of the New York Times in the last year making up a lie about the Trump administration. By contrast, Trump lies several times a day, according to the Washington Post. Nearly half the country thinks the mainstream media makes up lies about the president. Now, this is all a depressing prognosis. I wish at the end I could wrap it up and tell you something rosy and cheerful. I'm not saying the collapse of democracy in the United States is inevitable. I'm not even saying it's more likely than not. I think it's less likely than not. But even if there were a 10% chance, don't you think we ought to be concerned? If I told you there was a 10% chance of nuclear war with North Korea, and most experts think the chances are significantly greater than 10%, you would start to lose sleep at night. Well, I think the chances of something dramatic happening to undermine our democracy, I think it's already happening, we people ought to be paying more attention. Democracy is failing in Poland, it's failing in Hungary, in Turkey, and in the Philippines. Those are all countries that 10 or 15 years ago we would have seen democracy as stable, as solidly established, and we would be very surprised to hear that it was failing in those countries. There is no reason in the world why it can't happen here. It's true, our democratic institutions are more firmly entrenched. It will be harder for it to happen here, but it's not impossible. I'm certainly not implying that there's nothing to be done about this. I think there are literally dozens of things that people can do. You can get out and protest. You can talk to your friends who are not aware of how dire the situation is. You can give money to organizations. You can volunteer to work for political candidates. You can run for office yourself, as thousands of people who I think 2 years ago would not have dreamed of doing are doing today. But the first step is people have to realize how at risk democracy is, and I think the threat is pretty darn severe, especially compared to what anyone, I'm almost 60 years old, anyone who's lived during my lifetime would have thought this was unimaginable, and yet we see it happening. So I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Mike.